Okay, well, I would like to first of all thank you, Louisa and Hendrik, for having us. And it's an honor to be part of this initiative and this panel. I'll share this presentation with Nick Stevens, my colleague, and we'll present a project we have been working on, which is about some ways of embedding safety into cities through the design of resilient public spaces. So throughout these challenging times with the lockdown of COVID-19, we have been questioning what can we learn from these changes in the dynamics of public spaces? What are the implications for urban planning and design? And is it possible to design safer places? So if we have a new outbreak, maybe the public spaces could perform in a different way and offer more possibilities under those circumstances. But we also know that once we can, we will want to have our old lives back. So we want this return to our familiar routines, and our memories of the lockdown will slowly fade away. So there is a possibility as well that we won't see many changes. So there are different ways of seeing this at this stage that we are. There are, however, some situations when we can't go back. And what you are seeing on the screen is Christchurch in New Zealand. That was a situation where after a very big earthquake in 2011, there was a lot of disruption, and there wasn't really an option of going back. So there wasn't much left, and what was left wasn't safe. So Christchurch is an example of a traumatic and fast disaster where action was the only option. It is interesting to realize that COVID-19 has also been referred to as a fast disaster if compared to climate change. So as we can actually see the impact of it in our lives and in the public spaces where we live in. But thinking of climate change, what you see on the left, on the map on the left, is what came to be known as the red zone. So the red zone was an area that cannot be built anymore due to the changes in the soil and the risk for flood. Some land actually sank during the earthquake, and so it became even lower than the sea level. So the map on the right is the prediction for the 100-year flooding, which actually shows exactly the same area that then became the red zone. So what we can see is that 100-year prediction becoming reality in 10 seconds of earthquake. So when we think about the temporality of all these events, the earthquake is a really fast event. Climate change is a slow event, it's a slow disaster. And the COVID-19 sits in between in that regard. The issue or the challenge that we have is that the slower the disaster, the more chances we have to choose not to act. So what can we actually take for the future? What can we learn? Some lessons that Christchurch show us is that they had to be creative. They had to bring life back to the city. And so we saw a lot of pop-up areas that were meant to be safe. So safety became the priority. And then, of course, we can think, of course, safety was a priority. It was post-earthquake. It was a very disturbed environment. But what is interesting for us is that safety is also a priority now. And both disaster or both situations are directly related to density. So while in the earthquake, the buildings became a threat because another earthquake could happen, people also became, like a very crowded place could be an issue. Like we were always getting into places trying to look for the exit. What if something happens? How do we move? What is this mobility and our capacity to exist? And in the pandemic, also the density of people and a lot of people in the same place does become an issue. So we are looking at what happened in that period of the earthquake, and especially in the recovery phase, not specifically just after the earthquake where there was all that disruption, but when it started to be rebuilt. And we are doing that based on two questions. If we prioritize safety in the design of public space, as in Christchurch, would it be possible to have spaces that better perform in the event of a new disease outbreak? And are there any dimensions of public spaces that need to be considered so these spaces do this better performance when needed? Now, I'll pass on to Nick Nick is going to explain how we are doing this study.
Yeah, thank you, Silvia, and hello, everyone. So, look, we're exploring these complex inquiries using a systems approach. Now, to use a systems approach is not new. You know, the city as machine, Le Corbusier, the city as organism, a biological view. But here we're drawing on the scientific legacy of human factors and ergonomics discipline, and in particular, this idea of socio-technical systems. So that's humans' interactions with their environments. And such approaches are often already used in the design of safety critical complex systems. So think about things like road transport and aviation, defence and security, command and control, healthcare. And if perhaps we view urban development, indeed public space, as a safety critical system, we can better explore their capacity to be resilient in the face of disaster. So the approach is really defined by the ideas that safety is impacted by the decisions and actions of every human and non-human element within that system, that events and outcomes are caused by multiple interacting contributory factors. The effective countermeasures focus on systemic changes rather than individual components. And so taking this perspective, we've been exploring the implications of the COVID lockdown and also using the systems approach to learn from the past disasters such as the Christchurch earthquake. So next slide, please. So the approach we've used is a work domain analysis. Now it looks rather complex, but in fact it's a simplification of a complex process, and it's well established in human factors. And what it does is it describes a system across 5 levels, from the overall purpose, the aspirations of the system at the very top, to the way in which you measure the progress towards that, the activities or the function the system needs to perform in the middle, and then the processes and resources available. So what it is, it's a simple but not simplistic representation of complexity. It's inclusive of all system elements and their interdependencies, which is unique. It's also formative in nature, so it describes what could happen rather than what should happen. And importantly, the idea of means-ends relationship. So really what, why, and how are significant. So you can see at the bottom, at the very bottom there in that red, and you're not expected to read it, but in 2015, for a project for the Seven Senses Foundation, we developed a systems model of university accessible public space. So we're calling that a pre-COVID model. And in our recent work, we've been able to overlay the implications of COVID lockdown on that model. And in particular, what activities or functions in the public space have ceased to exist. So what were the implications on the overall system's performance? And it revealed, 15 of the 24 critical functions of public space ceased under lockdown. So for example, the provision of places to meet, public amenities, social interaction, of course, were no longer available. And unsurprisingly, these were shown to impact kind of individual and community and health and well-being at the very top. Next slide, please. So importantly, when we've also been considering the learnings from the FAST disasters, we begin to see or to consider public safety as a safety critical domain. There are really some key functions that were lacking in that pre-COVID model that we would consider are important for the development of resilient public space going forward. So they included things like retreat and individual spaces, spaces where the main activity is based on people alone or in small groups. Environmental comfort. So considering those spaces, then the visual, thermal, the acoustic and the ergonomic comfort associated with those sorts of spaces. People's protection from adjacent built forms, so not at risk from infrastructure or adjacent buildings. Optimizing the ability to leave, so having numerous ways of exiting or entering public space are critical. And importantly, also maximizing the use of soft landscape, so landscape that frames the movement of the space, that permits users access to nature and greenery as well. So next slide, please. So look, the research that we've been doing is exploratory. It's been terrific that we had a pre-COVID public space model to work from, but the indications are that that model and the safety critical perspective are in fact useful and do provide new insights for building resilience in public space. They allow us to explore the complex interactions in urban systems, and even that systems of systems viewpoint. We begin to interrogate cities and public spaces for what we know that they already are. They're complex settings, which are certainly more than the sum of their parts. And we need these insights now before we begin to slip back into the business as usual approach to the delivery of our public spaces. So thank you very much.